In the dim hours before dawn, when silence wraps itself around the world like a burial shroud, there exists a threshold between memory and nightmare. Here, in this sacred darkness, the stories of our ancestors whisper through stone corridors and abandoned halls, carrying with them the weight of fears too ancient to name, too persistent to forget. The medieval world was not the simple tapestry of knights and castles that our modern minds have woven from fragments of fairy tales. It was a realm where shadow and light danced together in an eternal waltz, where the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin as parchment, and where every cobblestone held secrets that could chill the blood of even the most faithful soul. Tonight, we walk together through these forgotten corridors of human terror, where superstition was not merely belief, but a way of survival, where the darkness held both devils and salvation, and where the very stones of cathedrals absorbed the prayers of the desperate. These are the stories that carved themselves into the collective memory of Europe. Tales that shaped the dreams and nightmares of countless generations. Listen carefully, for in the spaces between our words, you may hear the echo of footsteps that walked these paths centuries before us, carrying burdens of fear and wonder that we have only begun to understand. The candle flame gutters in the stone chamber, casting shadows that dance like specters against the monastery walls. Brother Thomas draws his woolen robe closer as he descends the spiral staircase, each footstep echoing through corridors that have witnessed 1,000 confessions, 1,000 fears whispered in the dead of night. In his trembling hands, he carries something that should not exist in the house of God. Something that speaks of darker arts than any prayer book dares to name. It is the winter of 1483. Lay in a Benedictine monastery nestled deep within the forests of northern France, leaving behind it a harvest of graves and a population haunted by visions of mortality. But tonight, Brother Thomas carries a burden more terrible than any pestilence, more cursed than any disease that ravages flesh and bone. In his hands lies a relic of the condemned, a fragment of evil so potent that even the holy ground beneath his feet seems to recoil from its presence. The hand of glory, severed from a thief who died choking on the scaffold, his final breath carrying curses that poisoned the very air around the gallows. The chronicles of medieval Europe speak of this abomination in hushed tones, a talisman crafted from the left hand of an executed criminal, prepared according to rituals that predate Christianity itself. The hand must be cut while the corpse still swings from the rope, the blood drained under a waning moon, the flesh pickled in salt and herbs that grow only in graveyards. Then, wrapped in a burial shroud and compressed for 15 days, it emerges transformed into something neither fully dead nor entirely of this world. Brother Thomas has read the testimonies, seen the confessions extracted under torture from those accused of possessing such unholy relics. They speak of candles made from the fat of the hanged man, wicks woven from his hair, flames that burn with a light that blinds the righteous but guides the wicked. When lit and held in the grasp of the severed hand, this cursed illumination is said to paralyze all who sleep within its glow, turning homes into theaters of helplessness where thieves may walk freely among their victims, invisible as ghosts, silent as the grave itself. The trembling monk remembers the trial of Margot Le Sorciere, burned at the stake in Rouen 3 winters past. Under questioning, she confessed to selling such hands to cutthroats and murderers, teaching them the words that must be spoken to awaken the dead flesh, the prayers that must be offered to the dark powers that animate the corruption of human remains. Her screams, they say, echoed through the town square long after the flames had consumed her voice, a sound that married agony with defiance in ways that chilled even the hardened hearts of the executioners. Yet here, in this sacred place where the bones of saints rest in golden reliquaries, and the incense of centuries has sanctified every stone, Brother Thomas holds proof that such darkness exists beyond the realm of confession and superstition. The hand was discovered 3 days ago, hidden beneath the altar of the chapel dedicated to Saint Bartholomew, wrapped in silk that had once been white but now bore stains, the color of old blood. To the bishop, but no response has come. Instead, each night brings new terrors. Brothers wake to find their cells rearranged, their sacred books opened to pages of blasphemy, their rosaries tangled in shapes that hurt the mind to contemplate, and always the smell that follows in the wake of the unholy relic, a scent of earth and corruption that no amount of holy water can cleanse. As Thomas reaches the deepest chamber of the monastery, where the walls are carved with protective symbols, older than the Christian faith itself, he can feel the weight of watching eyes. The hand in his grasp grows warm, as if blood still pulsed through vessels that should have crumbled to dust decades ago. He sets it upon the stone altar, this altar that has never known consecration, this place where the old gods once received offerings of a different kind. The chronicles speak truth, he realizes with a horror that transforms his faith into something sharp and desperate. The hand of glory is no mere superstition born from fear and ignorance. It is a bridge between worlds, a conduit through which the malice of the executed reaches back to claim dominion over the living. Every criminal who died with hatred in his heart, every soul that departed this world with curses upon his lips, leaves behind an echo that can be captured, shaped, wielded by those who know the words that unlock the chambers of the damned. In the flickering candlelight, Thomas begins to understand why the ancient texts speak of such relics with reverence rather than revulsion. They are not merely tools of thieves and murderers, but fragments of a deeper truth about the nature of death itself. They whisper of the terrible possibility that hatred can survive the grave, that malice can outlive the flesh that housed it, that the desire for revenge can animate even the severed parts of the dead. The hand begins to move upon the altar, fingers curling as if grasping for something beyond the reach of mortal sight. Brother Thomas falls to his knees, his prayers becoming desperate incantations against a darkness that seems to seep from the very stones around him. He understands now why the museums of our modern age display such relics behind thick glass, why curators speak in whispers of the unease that settles over visitors who gaze too long upon these preserved fragments of medieval terror. For in the end, the hand of glory represents more than superstition or the fevered imaginings of a simpler age. It embodies the eternal human fear that death may not be the ending we hope it to be, that some hungers are too strong to be satisfied by mere mortality, and that the darkness we carry within our hearts may find ways to persist long after the light behind our eyes has been extinguished forever. The candle flame dies, and in the sudden darkness, Brother Thomas hears the sound of fingers drumming against stone, patient and persistent as the heartbeat of eternity itself. The morning sun filters through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the flagstone floor of the cathedral, but Alina cannot shake the chill that has settled in her bones. She kneels before the altar of Our Lady of Sorrows, her fingers working obsessively over the coral beads of her rosary, each prayer a desperate ward against the weight of watching eyes that follows her through every waking moment. It is the year 1347 in the bustling merchant city of Valencia, where the narrow streets echo with the calls of traders and the clatter of cartwheels over cobblestone. But beneath the familiar sounds of commerce and daily life, Alina hears something else entirely, something that speaks to the ancient terror that has haunted humanity since the first envious glance was cast between neighbors, since the first bitter heart wished ill upon another's good fortune. The evil eye has found her, marked her with its invisible brand, and no amount of prayer seems capable of breaking the curse that draws misfortune to her doorstep like iron filings to a lodestone. The chronicles of medieval Europe are filled with testimonies to this most pervasive of supernatural fears, this belief that envy could manifest as a tangible force capable of withering crops, souring milk, causing children to waste away with mysterious fevers, and bringing ruin to the most prosperous households. From the merchant republics of Italy to the wind-swept moors of Scotland, from the wine country of France to the trading ports of the Hanseatic League, no corner of Christendom was immune to the terror of the Malocchio, the mal d'ojo, the blick that could strike without warning and destroy without mercy. Alina remembers the exact moment when the curse fell upon her, though she did not recognize it at the time for what it was. She had been walking through the marketplace, her fine silk dress rustling with each step, her purse heavy with the gold coins that marked her family's success in the spice trade with the distant Orient. Behind her walked two servants carrying baskets laden with delicacies for the feast. She was planning to celebrate her daughter's betrothal to the son of a wealthy cloth merchant. It was then that she noticed her, the old woman hunched beside a stall selling wilted vegetables and dialed bread. Their eyes met for just an instant, but in that brief contact, Alina saw something that made her blood freeze in her veins. It was not hatred exactly, nor even anger, but something deeper and more corrosive than either. It was the look of someone who had been ground down by poverty and disappointment until nothing remained but the bitter dregs of what had once been human kindness. Someone whose heart had been hollowed out by want until only envy could fill the empty spaces. The woman's lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear over the noise of the marketplace. But Alina felt their impact like a physical blow. Her step faltered, her purse suddenly felt heavy as lead in her hands, and for one terrible moment she found herself unable to breathe, as if the very air around her had grown thick and poisonous. That was 3 weeks ago, and since that moment, Elena's world has crumbled with the inexorable precision of a carefully orchestrated campaign of destruction. First came the news that her husband's ship, laden with precious cargo from the Indies, had been lost in a storm just 2 days out of Cadiz. Then her eldest son fell from his horse during what should have been a routine ride through the countryside. breaking his leg so badly that the physician whispered of amputation. Her daughter's betrothal was broken when rumors began to spread through the city about the family's declining fortune, whispers that seemed to spring from nowhere and everywhere. At once, the servants began to leave, claiming they could no longer bear the atmosphere of misfortune that clung to the household like fog. Mirrors cracked without cause, wine turned to vinegar in the cellar, and the roses in Elena's garden withered overnight despite the careful tending of her gardener. Even the cats that had once purred contentedly in patches of sunlight now avoided the house entirely, as if some invisible miasma warned them away from a place marked for ruin. Elena has sought help from every quarter that medieval society offers to the desperate. She has commissioned prayers from the most holy monks, purchased relics blessed by saints whose martyrdom purchased them entry into paradise, and worn about her neck every protective charm that the wisdom of generations has deemed effective against the power of envious eyes. Her chemise is sewn with threads dyed red with madder root and blessed by 3 different priests. Her shoes bear iron nails arranged in the pattern of the cross, and her hair is bound with ribbons that have been soaked in holy water drawn from the font of Santiago de Compostela. Yet still the curse persists, growing stronger with each passing day as if feeding upon her desperation. The physician who tends to her son speaks in worried whispers of a malady that defies all understanding, a wasting sickness that seems to drain the young man's vitality without affecting any specific organ or limb. Her husband, returned from the disaster that claimed his ship and cargo, sits for hours staring at nothing, his mind apparently clouded by a melancholy so profound that no entreaty can reach him. The learned men of the church speak of the evil eye as a manifestation of humanity's fallen nature, evidence of how sin can transform the natural faculties of sight and thought into weapons capable of inflicting harm across vast distances. They cite the writings of the Church Fathers, who warned that envy was among the most dangerous of sins, precisely because it could reach beyond the boundaries of the individual soul to poison the world around it. But Elena knows that theological explanations offer little comfort to those who must live with the practical consequences of supernatural malice. She has read the treatises that catalog the symptoms of being overlooked by envious eyes, the sudden onset of headaches that no herb can soothe, the way food loses its flavor and wine its potency, the manner in which luck turns sour and fortune abandons even the most careful plans. More terrifying still are the chronicles that describe the fate of those who attempt to return the curse to its sender. They speak of mirrors used to reflect the evil gaze back upon its source, of complicated rituals involving salt and silver, of prayers that must be spoken backwards while walking counterclockwise around churches at midnight. But they also warn of the terrible vengeance that can fall upon those who dare to fight supernatural malice with supernatural means, of curses that multiply and spread like ripples in a pond until entire families, entire neighborhoods are consumed by waves of misfortune that recognize no boundaries of innocence or guilt. As Elena kneels in the cathedral, surrounded by the familiar comfort of incense and candlelight, she finds herself contemplating the most frightening possibility of all, that the evil eye is not an aberration or a throwback to pagan superstition, but rather a fundamental aspect of human nature that civilization has never quite managed to tame. Perhaps envy truly can manifest as a physical force. Perhaps the hatred that burns in disappointed hearts really can reach across space to touch and corrupt everything it encounters. The thought fills her with a despair deeper than any she has known, for if this is true, then no amount of prayer or piety can offer true protection. We are all vulnerable to the malice of our neighbors, all potential victims of emotions too primal to be constrained by law or custom or the fear of divine retribution. The afternoon light fades through the stained glass windows, and Alina rises from her knees with the stiff movements of someone who has aged years in the space of weeks. Tomorrow she will try again, will seek out new charms and fresh blessings, will continue the desperate campaign to break free from the invisible chains that bind her to ruin. But tonight, as she walks home through streets that suddenly seem full of watching eyes and whispered conversations, she cannot shake the feeling that somewhere in the shadows of the marketplace, an old woman is smiling with the satisfaction of vengeance finally achieved. Her hollow heart warmed by the knowledge that prosperity, like youth and health and happiness, is always temporary, always vulnerable to the corrosive power of a glance that wishes nothing but ill. The mist rolls across the Yorkshire moors like the breath of sleeping giants, thick and gray and suffused with secrets that the earth itself seems reluctant to surrender. Thomas Whitmore pulls his cloak closer as he guides his horse along the ancient track that winds between standing stones older than memory, older than the Christian cross that marks the village churchyard where his ancestors lie buried beneath slabs of weathered granite. It is the autumn of 1577, and Thomas rides with news that cannot wait for daylight. News that will send ripples of terror through every cottage and manor house, from Bungay to Blithburg. Behind him, the village of Blyth still smolders, though no earthly fire caused the destruction that has left the Church of Holy Trinity in ruins. And 2 souls departed this world in circumstances that defy all rational explanation. For Thomas has seen the black shuck, the phantom hound whose appearance heralds not mere death but disaster that touches entire communities, calamities that seem to spring from the very fabric of fate itself. And in seeing it, he has become part of a tradition as old as the stones that mark these moors, a witness to phenomena that learned men dismiss as superstition, even as they cross themselves when darkness falls and the wind carries sounds that have no earthly source. The chronicles speak of such creatures throughout the length and breadth of medieval Europe, spectral hounds that walk the borderlands between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. In Germany, they call it Der Schwarzhund. In France, Le Chien Noir. In Ireland, the Two Estachus. Bang is said to summon souls to their final judgment. But here in East Anglia, where the North Sea crashes against cliffs that have watched the rise and fall of kingdoms, the creature bears the name that children whisper in their beds when thunder rolls across the fenlands: Black Shuck, the doom dog whose eyes burn with the light of damnation itself. Thomas remembers every detail of the encounter, though part of his mind still rebels against the evidence of his own senses. He had been walking through the churchyard after evening prayers, making his way home through the familiar landscape of tilted headstones and yew trees, whose roots drink deep from soil enriched by centuries of Christian burial. The night was still, the air heavy with the scent of rain to come, and the only sound was the distant murmur of the North Sea, beating against the rocks below the village. It was then that he heard the breathing, a sound like bellows working in a forge, but somehow wrong, as if the rhythm belonged to lungs far larger than any earthly creature could possess. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the church walls and the ancient stones, until Thomas could not tell whether it originated to his left or right, before him or behind. Then he saw the eyes, 2 points of red light, hovering at the height of a man's shoulders, but set too far apart to belong to any human face. They burned with their own internal fire, not reflecting the moonlight, but generating illumination that seemed to drink darkness from the air around it. As Thomas watched in frozen terror, the lights began to move, not with the bobbing gait of something walking on legs, but with the fluid grace of smoke given substance and purpose. The creature materialized slowly, as if the night itself were condensing into a shape that violated every natural law. First came the outline of a head the size of a cartwheel, then the suggestion of shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world's sorrow. Its fur was blacker than the spaces between stars, absorbing light so completely that looking at it was like staring into the void that existed before. God spoke creation into being, but it was the creature's eyes that held Thomas' transfixed eyes. That seemed to see not just his physical form, but the very essence of his soul. In those burning orbs, he glimpsed visions that mortal minds were never meant to witness, the moment of his own death. Still years in the future, but approaching with the inevitability of tide and season. The plague that would sweep through the village the following spring, leaving half the houses empty and silent. The wars that would rage across these peaceful fields when the old queen died, and ambitious men reached for her crown. The vision lasted only seconds, but when it ended, Thomas found himself on his knees in the wet grass, his body shaking with a palsy that had nothing to do with the cold night air. The black shuck regarded him with what might have been curiosity or contempt, its massive head tilted to one side like a domestic dog considering a new toy. Then, without warning, it threw back its head and howled. The sound was like nothing Thomas had ever heard, a combination of wind through graveyards and the death cries of every soul that had ever departed this world in anguish. It seemed to come not just from the creature's throat, but from the earth itself, as if the very stones were giving voice to centuries of accumulated grief and loss. Windows shattered in the cottages below, milk soured in every dairy from Blyth. 2 southwalled and pregnant women woke with cramps that sent them rushing to midwives who could offer no comfort for pains that had no earthly cause. When the howl finally died away, the black shuck was gone, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the lingering scent of burning sulfur and the knowledge that some terrible reckoning was at hand. Thomas did not have long to wait before dawn broke over the marshlands. The bells of Holy Trinity began to toll, not with the measured rhythm of call to prayer, but with the frantic clanging that announced catastrophe. By the time Thomas reached the village, half the population had already gathered in the square, their faces pale with the same nameless dread that had settled over the countryside like a plague of the spirit. The church doors stood open, revealing an interior filled with smoke that bore no resemblance to incense or the aftermath of any normal fire. Through the haze, witnesses would later swear they saw shapes moving, shadows that danced with purpose and malevolence. Then came the screams, cut short with an abruptness that was somehow more terrible than any sound of prolonged agony. When the smoke finally cleared, two of the most respected men in the village lay dead upon the altar steps, their bodies unmarked by flame or blade, but their faces frozen in expressions of terror so profound that the women who prepared them for burial found their own sleep haunted for weeks afterward. The church itself bore scars that defied explanation, claw marks gouged deep into stone pillars, pews overturned with a violence that spoke of supernatural strength, and burned into the flagstones near the altar the outline of a massive paw print that still smoked hours after the creature had departed. Now Thomas rides through the night with this burden of witness, carrying news that will add another chapter to the chronicles of supernatural terror that have haunted these lands since before the Romans built their walls and roads. He knows that learned men will seek rational explanations, will speak of lightning strikes and heart failure, of mass hysteria and the power of suggestion. But Thomas has looked into the eyes of the black shuck, has seen the future written in flames that burn without fuel, and he knows that some truths transcend the boundaries of human understanding. The phantom hounds that stalk the moors of England are more than mere harbingers of death. They are reminders that the ordered world of church and manor, of law and custom, rests upon foundations far less solid than we dare to admit. They are glimpses of the chaos that waits beyond the circles of firelight and blessing, the darkness that existed before creation and will endure long after the last human voice falls silent as his horse picks its way carefully along the treacherous path. Thomas finds himself wondering whether the black shuck appears to warn of disaster or to announce that the fabric of reality itself has grown thin, that the barriers between worlds have weakened enough to allow creatures of nightmare to walk freely among the living. Perhaps, he thinks with a shudder that has nothing to do with the cold wind from the North Sea, the phantom hounds are not visitors from some distant realm of the dead, but residents of this world, who have simply been hidden from our sight, waiting patiently for their time to emerge from shadow into the harsh light of human awareness. The mist thickens around him, and somewhere in the distance, Thomas hears the sound of breathing that belongs to no earthly creature, the rhythm of lungs that have never drawn mortal air, the patient exhalation of something that hunts not just individuals but entire ages, entire civilizations, entire species that have grown too comfortable in their illusion of permanence. The black shuck is abroad tonight, and Thomas rides toward dawn carrying the weight of prophecy in his heart, knowing that some knowledge is too terrible to bear, but too important to abandon, too dangerous to share, but too crucial to keep silent. The autumn light filters weakly through the rose window of the Abbey of Saint Denis, casting colored patterns across the marble floor where Brother Anselm sad kneels in prayer before the golden reliquary that houses the finger bone of Saint Genevieve. But his devotions are interrupted by something that should bring comfort to any faithful heart, something that instead fills him with a dread so profound that his hands shake as he makes the sign of the cross. The bone is weeping, it is the year, and across Europe the great mortality sweeps through cities and villages like the scythe of death himself, leaving behind a landscape of empty houses and overgrown fields, of children orphaned and parents grieving, of entire bloodlines erased in the space of weeks. But here in this sacred place, where the remains of martyrs and saints have rested in peace for centuries, something unprecedented is occurring, something that challenges the very foundations of faith and reason. From the crystal housing that protects the precious relic, a clear liquid seeps slowly, drop by precious drop, collecting in a small silver basin that Brother Anselm has placed beneath the reliquary. The fluid has no earthly explanation, for the bone itself has been dry as dust for more than 300 years, sealed away from moisture and corruption by the finest craftsmen that Christendom can produce. Yet there it flows, this impossible lacrimation, and with each drop that falls, Brother Anselm feels the weight of divine sorrow pressing down upon his shoulders like a physical burden, for he knows what the chronicles record, what the learned doctors of the Church have written about such phenomena when the bones of saints weep. It is not a sign of blessing but of warning, not an indication of divine favor but a herald of judgment to come. Throughout the monasteries and cathedrals of medieval Europe, such miracles have been recorded with meticulous care by scribes whose duty it is to document the ways in which heaven communicates with earth. In Cologne, the skull of Saint Ursula shed tears of blood on the eve of the plague that devastated the Rhineland. In Santiago de Compostela, witnesses swore that the hand of St. James dripped oil that smelled of myrrh and sorrow for 3 days before word arrived that the Moorish armies had crossed the Pyrenees once again. The phenomenon defies every law of nature that the wisest philosophers have discerned, every principle of preservation that the most skilled embalmers have perfected. These bones, dried by centuries and protected by the most sacred of environments, should be as incapable of producing moisture as stones are of bleeding or iron of weeping. Yet here the evidence lies before Brother Anselm's wondering eyes, proof that the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds is far more permeable than most souls dare to imagine. He remembers the words of Abbot Suger, who witnessed a similar miracle in this very abbey 50 years ago, when the arm bone of Saint Denis himself began to weep on the night before the King of France fell gravely ill with a fever that nearly claimed his life. The saints, Suger had written in his chronicle, partake of both earthly matter and heavenly essence. And when great calamity approaches, the divine spirit that animates their remains can manifest itself through signs that transcend the natural order. But Brother Anselm finds little comfort in theological explanations as he watches the impossible tears continue to fall. Each drop seems to carry with it the weight of accumulated human sorrow, the tears of mothers who have buried their children, of children who have watched their parents waste away with the sweating sickness, of entire communities that have been wiped from the face of the earth as if they had never existed at all. The weeping began 3 days ago, at the moment when news arrived that the plague had reached Paris itself, that the great city which had seemed too populous and powerful to fall to any earthly disease was now counting its dead in the thousands. Since then, the flow has continued without pause, and Brother Anselm has maintained his vigil, documenting each detail with the precision that his vows demand, recording the times when the flow increases or decreases, noting the color and consistency of the mysterious fluid. What disturbs him most is not the impossibility of the phenomenon, but its timing, its precision, its terrible accuracy as a harbinger of disaster. For the chronicles are clear on this point. The weeping of saintly relics is never random, never merely decorative. It comes always as a warning, always as a sign that the natural order itself has been disrupted by some approaching catastrophe, too vast for human minds to encompass fully. As Brother Anselm kneels in the colored light of the rose window, he finds himself wondering about the nature of sainthood itself, about what it might mean for human remains to retain some connection to the divine consciousness that once animated the living flesh. The Church teaches that the saints exist in a state of beatific vision, absorbed in contemplation of God's infinite glory, removed from the sorrows and struggles of mortal existence. Yet, if this is true, how can their earthly remains respond to worldly events with such apparent awareness, such emotional intensity? Perhaps, he thinks, the separation between heaven and earth is not as complete as theological treatises suggest. Perhaps the saints, in their exalted state, perceive more clearly than any living soul the intricate connections that bind all of creation together, the hidden threads of consequence that link the actions of individuals to the fate of nations, the sins of the present to the judgments of the future. The thought fills him with a mixture of awe and terror. For, if the saints truly weep for the sufferings of humanity, if their glorified remains can still respond to mortal anguish with supernatural sympathy, then what does this say about the magnitude of the disasters that their tears portend? How great must be the coming sorrow to move beings who dwell in paradise to manifest their grief through miraculous signs in the world of matter and decay. Brother Anselm has read the accounts of similar phenomena from across Christendom, stories that seem to form a pattern too consistent to dismiss as mere superstition or fraud. In Rome, the bones of St. Peter are said to have wept tears that stained the marble of his tomb on the night before the eternal city fell to barbarian armies. In Constantinople, witnesses claimed that the relics of St. John Chrysostom produced drops of what appeared to be blood when the news arrived that the holy city would soon face siege from enemies who denied the divinity of Christ. Each account speaks of the same mysterious timing, the same uncanny correspondence between supernatural signs and natural disasters. It is as if the saints, from their vantage point in eternity, can perceive the approach of catastrophe long before mortal senses detect any warning, as if their purified spirits remain somehow attuned to the rhythms of history and the patterns of divine judgment. Yet what purpose do such warnings serve if they come too late to prevent the disasters they foretell? Brother Anselm has searched the theological writings for some explanation of this paradox, some understanding of why heaven would choose to communicate its knowledge through signs that inspire dread rather than hope, through miracles that announce doom rather than deliverance. Perhaps, he reflects, as another drop falls into the silver basin, the purpose is not prevention but preparation, not the avoidance of suffering but the sanctification of it. Perhaps the saints weep not to warn us away from our fate, but to remind us that even in the darkest hours, even when death stalks the land like a hungry beast, we are not abandoned. We are not forgotten by those who have gone before us into the light of eternal peace, the bell tower strikes the hour of vespers, and Brother Anselm rises from his knees with the stiff movements of one who has knelt too long in contemplation of mysteries too great for human comprehension. Tomorrow he will send word to the bishop, will report this miracle with all the detail that ecclesiastical protocol demands. But tonight, as he prepares to join his brothers in the evening prayers that have echoed through this sacred space for centuries, he cannot shake the feeling that the tears of Saint Genevieve are falling not just for the plague that ravages the world outside these walls, but for something deeper, something more fundamental about the human condition itself. They fall for the terrible fragility of flesh and the crushing weight of mortality, for the endless cycle of birth and death that no amount of faith or prayer can ultimately interrupt. To gather in the corners of the chapel, Brother Anselm lights a candle and places it beside the weeping reliquary. The flame flickers in the still air, casting moving shadows that seem almost alive, almost aware, as if the very stones of the abbey have absorbed something of the divine sorrow that flows from the impossible tears of a saint who died 3 centuries ago, but who continues to grieve for a world that has forgotten how to weep for itself. The frost lies thick upon the moor as Father Benedict makes his way through the pre-dawn darkness toward the bell tower of St. Bartholomew's Church. His breath forms clouds in the bitter air of this December morning in 1349, and beneath his woolen robe his heart beats with the irregular rhythm of a man who has witnessed something that challenges the very foundations of his faith. For 3 nights running, the bell of St. Bartholomew's has tolled the death knell at the stroke of midnight, its bronze voice cutting through the winter silence with the authority of centuries. But therein lies the mystery that has robbed Father Benedict of sleep and peace of mind. No human hand has touched the bell rope. No living soul has climbed the narrow steps to the bell chamber, and yet the great bell continues to announce death with an accuracy that seems to mock the natural order itself. It is the year of the great mortality, when the plague sweeps across Europe like a tide of darkness, leaving behind villages empty of all save the dead and the dying. Yet here in the isolated parish of Millbrook, the pestilence has not yet shown its face. The fields still yield their harvest, children still play in the streets, and mothers still sing lullaby to babies, who wake each morning with rosy cheeks and bright eyes. But the bell knows what mortal senses cannot yet perceive. It rings for deaths that have not yet occurred, for souls that will depart this world before the sun sets on another day. And with each mysterious tolling, Father Benedict feels the weight of supernatural knowledge pressing down upon his shoulders like the stone of the tower itself. The chronicles of medieval Europe are filled with accounts of such phenomena, bells that ring without cause to herald disasters that have not yet struck. In the monasteries of Germany, scribes recorded the bells of Cologne Cathedral, tolling continuously for 3 days before the earthquake that toppled half the city. In France, witnesses swore that the bells of Notre Dame rang out a funeral dirge on the morning that King Philip rode to his death at the Battle of Poitiers. Though no news of the battle would reach Paris for days, Father Benedict remembers the words of his predecessor, Father Aldrich, who served this parish for 60 years before age and blindness forced him into retirement. The old priest had spoken of the bells with a reverence that bordered on fear. claiming that bronze, cast in sacred foundries and blessed by bishops, could somehow absorb the prayers and sorrows of generations, becoming vessels of divine knowledge that transcended the limitations of earthly time and space. The bell knows, Father Aldrich had whispered on his deathbed, his clouded eyes fixed on something beyond the ceiling of his simple cell. It has heard the last confession of every soul in this parish for 300 years. It has told for every funeral, every moment of grief, every prayer for the dying. How can we be surprised if it begins to anticipate what it has witnessed so many times before? Now, as Father Benedict climbs the worn stone steps of the bell tower, each footfall echoing in the narrow chamber like a heartbeat in a tomb, he carries with him the burden of 3 nights' worth of impossible knowledge. Each time the bell has tolled its midnight warning, he has marked the name that comes to him in dreams, written it in the parish register with trembling fingers, and waited for death to claim its predicted victim. First came the tolling for Margaret, the baker's wife, whose bread had fed the village for 20 years. The bell rang 12 times at midnight, and by the following evening Margaret lay still in her bed, claimed by a fever that struck without warning and burned through her body like wildfire. Then came the warning for young Thomas the blacksmith's apprentice, strong as an ox and barely 16 years old. Again the bell sang its bronze prophecy, and again death arrived with punctual precision, this time in the form of a horse's kick that crushed the boy's skull while he worked the bellows last night. The bell tolled for Father Benedict himself. He reaches the bell chamber as the first pale light of dawn begins to touch the horizon, and there he finds what his heart already knew he would discover: the great bronze bell hanging motionless in its frame, the rope that should move it coiled neatly on the wooden platform, undisturbed by any human hand. Yet the evidence of his own ears cannot be denied. He heard the tolling, felt it in his bones and blood, counted each stroke as it announced his approaching doom with the certainty of mathematics itself. The bell of St. Bartholomew's was cast in the year 1047 by Master Aldwin the bell founder, whose reputation for crafting instruments of supernatural clarity and power stretched from York to Winchester. The bronze was mixed according to formulas passed down through generations of sacred metalworkers, incorporating silver blessed by bishops, iron taken from the nails of martyrs' crosses, and copper that had been purified in fires lit from candles that had burned before the tomb of St. Peter himself. But more than its sacred materials, what gives the bell its prophetic power is the accumulation of centuries of human sorrow that has been absorbed into its very substance. Every funeral mass, every requiem, every prayer for the dying has left its mark upon the bronze, until the bell has become something more than mere metal shaped by human craft. It has become a repository of mortal anguish, a vessel that holds the concentrated essence of 300 years of grief and loss. Father Benedict runs his hand along the bell's cold surface, feeling the slight vibrations that seem to pulse beneath his palm like a slow heartbeat. The bronze bears inscriptions in Latin that speak of death and resurrection, of the hope of eternal life that Christianity offers to all who die in faith. But beneath these pious words, the priest senses something older, something that predates the coming of Christ to these northern lands. An awareness that connects this bell to traditions of prophecy and doom that stretch back to the standing stones that dot the surrounding countryside. The mystery deepens when he discovers, carved into the wooden beam that supports the bell, a series of marks that seem to glow with their own faint light in the pre-dawn gloom. They are runes, the ancient writing of the Anglo-Saxon kings who ruled these lands before the Norman conquest brought new gods and new ways of understanding the relationship between the living and the dead. Father Benedict cannot read the archaic symbols, but their very presence in this Christian sanctuary speaks of continuities that transcend changes of faith and culture, perhaps. He thinks as he traces the mysterious marks with his finger. The power to predict death is not a gift granted by the God of the Christians, but an older magic that has simply adapted itself to new forms, new vessels, new ways of expressing truths that human societies have always needed to hear. Regardless of the names they give to their deities or the rituals they perform to ward off the darkness, the sun rises higher, casting long shadows through the bell chamber, and Father Benedict prepares to descend the tower steps and face what may be his final day in the world of the living. But as he turns to leave, the bell speaks to him one last time, not with its bronze voice, but with words that form themselves directly in his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. Death is not the ending, the voice says, neither male nor female, but somehow both, ancient beyond measure, yet intimate as a whisper between lovers. Death is the doorway through which all souls must pass to reach their true home. The bell does not announce tragedy, but transformation, not loss, but liberation from the prison of flesh that has held you captive since the moment of your birth. Father Benedict falls to his knees on the wooden platform, overwhelmed by a revelation that redefines everything he thought he knew about his calling, his faith, his understanding of the purpose that bells serve in the economy of salvation. They are not merely instruments that call the faithful to worship or announce the hours of prayer. They are bridges between worlds, conduits through which the wisdom of eternity can flow into the temporal realm where human beings struggle with the illusion that death is something to be feared rather than welcomed. As the morning light grows stronger and the sounds of waking village life begin to drift up from the streets below, Father Benedict understands that he has been chosen not for death, but for a deeper kind of service. The bell that tolled for him was not predicting his physical demise, but announcing his spiritual transformation, his evolution from a simple parish priest into something far more significant, a guardian of the threshold between life and death, a keeper of mysteries that most souls are not ready to comprehend. He descends from the tower with this new knowledge burning in his heart like a sacred flame, knowing that when midnight comes again and the bell of St. Bartholomew's rings out its bronze prophecy, he will be ready to serve as interpreter of its messages, translator of its warnings, shepherd of souls who must learn to hear in its tolling not the sound of ending, but the music of beginnings that have no end. The villagers who see him walking through the morning streets notice a change in their priest, a quality of otherworldly peace that seems to radiate from his very presence. Children who were once afraid of his stern sermons now approach him with trusting smiles, sensing that he carries within himself some secret knowledge that transforms fear into wonder, anxiety into acceptance. And when night falls and the bell tower stands silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Father Benedict takes his place beside the great bronze prophet, ready to receive whatever messages it may choose to share, whatever truths it may reveal about the nature of existence and the meaning of mortality. For he has learned that some bells do not merely mark the passage of time but serve as voices of eternity itself, speaking to those who have ears to hear of mysteries that lie beyond the reach of ordinary human understanding. The candle flame dances in the drafty chamber as Brother Matthias carefully unwraps the linen bindings that have protected the body of Sister Agatha for more than 200 years. His hands tremble not from cold, but from the weight of what he knows he will find beneath the shroud. What generations of monks before him have witnessed and documented in chronicles that few outside these walls will ever be permitted to read. It is the feast day of St. Lucy in the year 1452, and Brother Matthias serves as keeper of the relics in the Benedictine monastery of Sant'Andrea. Nestled in the hills above Florence, where the morning mist clings to cypress trees like the breath of sleeping angels. But the task that brings him to this stone chamber beneath the chapel has nothing to do with celebration or joy, and everything to do with a mystery that challenges the very foundations of natural philosophy. Sister Agatha refuses to decay. The chronicles speak of such phenomena throughout the Christian world. Bodies that defy the universal law of corruption that claims all earthly flesh. Corpses that remain as fresh as the day they were laid to rest, despite the passage of decades or even centuries. The Church calls them incorruptibles and attributes their preservation to the sanctifying power of exceptional holiness. Evidence that divine grace can triumph over even the most fundamental processes of nature. But Brother Matthias, who has served as guardian of these mysteries for 30 years, has begun to wonder whether the truth might be more complex than theological explanations suggest. For he has seen too much, documented too many details that seem to point toward conclusions that no faithful monk should dare to entertain. Possibilities that would shake the foundations of everything he has been taught to believe about the relationship between body and soul, between mortality and the sacred. Sister Agatha died in the plague year of 1348, one of the few members of the nearby convent of Santa Margherita who succumbed not to the sweating sickness, but to what the physicians of that time called a fever of the spirit, a malady that seemed to consume her from within while leaving her body unmarked by visible disease. She had been known throughout Tuscany for the intensity of her mystical experiences, for visions that left her unconscious for days at a time, speaking in tongues that scholars claimed resembled languages that had been dead for 1,000 years. When she died, her fellow sisters prepared her body for burial according to the customs of their order, washing her limbs with water blessed by the Bishop of Florence, clothing her in the simple brown habit that had been her only garment in life, and laying her to rest in a tomb carved from local stone and sealed with lead to protect her remains from the corruption of earthly elements. But when the tomb was opened 20 years later to make room for another burial, the sisters found something that defied both expectation and explanation. Sister Agatha's body lay exactly as they had left it, her skin still soft and warm to the touch, her hair still lustrous black despite her advanced age at death, her features composed in an expression of such profound peace that several of the Younger nuns fainted at the sight. Word of the miracle spread quickly through the religious communities of central Italy, and soon pilgrims began arriving at Santa Margherita to witness the incorruptible saint whose preservation was taken as clear evidence of divine favor. But with the pilgrims came questions that the sisters found increasingly difficult to answer. Observations that seemed to point toward explanations far stranger than mere sanctity. Brother Matthias carefully lifts the linen shroud from Sister Agatha's face and feels his breath catch in his throat, just as it has on every previous occasion when he has been called upon to examine the impossible preservation of her remains. Her skin retains the soft glow of health, her lips still bear the faint rose color of life, and her closed eyelids flutter as if she dreams of visions too beautiful for mortal minds to comprehend. But it is not just the absence of decay that disturbs him. It is the subtle signs of continued vitality that seem to mock everything he believes about the nature of death itself. Her fingernails continue to grow, requiring periodic trimming by the sisters who tend her tomb. Her hair maintains its lustrous darkness, showing no sign of the graying that had begun to appear in her final years of life. Most disturbing of all, witnesses have reported seeing her chest rise and fall with the rhythm of breathing, as if some spark of life continues to animate her mortal frame. Despite the undeniable fact of her death, the church authorities, who have investigated the phenomenon, speak carefully of divine mysteries that transcend human understanding, of the power of extraordinary holiness to suspend the natural laws that govern earthly matter. But Brother Matthias has read the older texts, the manuscripts that predate Christianity's arrival in these lands, documents that speak of preservation techniques known to ancient peoples who understood secrets that the modern world has forgotten. He has studied the accounts of Egyptian embalmers who could render flesh immortal through the application of rare minerals and exotic unguents, of Greek philosophers who claimed to have discovered methods of extending life indefinitely through the manipulation of subtle energies that flow through all living things. And he has noted the curious fact that many of the incorruptible saints seem to have been mystics and visionaries, individuals who claim to have experienced direct contact with supernatural powers that might have left permanent marks upon their physical substance. As Brother Matthias continues his examination, carefully documenting each detail for the chronicles that future generations will study, he becomes aware of something that sends a chill through his very soul. Sister Agatha's eyes, which have remained closed for more than a century, seem to be moving beneath their lids, tracking something that only she can see, following the progress of visions that continue to unfold in the mysterious realm that exists between life and death. He leans closer, drawn by a fascination that borders on obsession, and for one terrible moment he believes he can hear something. A whispered prayer in Latin so archaic that he recognizes only fragments of its meaning. Words that speak of gateways opening and barriers dissolving, of souls that refuse to be contained by the conventional boundaries of existence. The temperature in the chamber seems to drop by degrees, and Brother Matthias becomes aware that he is no longer alone with the incorruptible saint. Shadows move at the edges of his vision, shapes that suggest the presence of other figures, other watchers who have been drawn by Sister Agatha's continuing existence on the threshold between worlds. He hears the rustle of robes that belong to no earthly order, feels the weight of attention from eyes that have never known the limitations of mortal sight. Sister Agatha's preservation. He realizes with a clarity that threatens to shatter his sanity is not evidence of divine favor, but proof of something far more unsettling. The possibility that consciousness can survive bodily death while remaining anchored to flesh through processes that modern understanding cannot even begin to fathom. She exists in a state that is neither fully alive nor completely dead, suspended in a liminal realm where the usual rules of existence no longer apply. The implications of this realization send tremors through the very foundations of his faith. If Sister Agatha continues to experience some form of awareness, if her preservation indicates not sanctity but a kind of spiritual imprisonment that prevents her soul from completing its journey to whatever lies beyond the grave, then what does this say about the nature of death itself? What does it suggest about the countless other incorruptible saints whose bodies rest in crypts and cathedrals throughout the Christian world? Brother Matthias backs away from the stone slab, his heart pounding with a terror that has nothing to do with fear of the supernatural, and everything to do with the possibility that he has glimpsed a truth too vast and terrible for human minds to bear. He carefully replaces the linen shroud over Sister Agatha's face, but even through the cloth he can sense her continued awareness, her patient waiting for something that may never come, or for something that approaches with the inexorable slowness of geological time. As he extinguishes the candle and makes his way back through the narrow corridors toward the world of the living, Brother Matthias carries with him knowledge that he can never share, understanding that would be branded as heresy by the very church he has sworn to serve. He knows now that the incorruptible saints are not examples of divine triumph over mortality, but evidence of a mystery so profound that it renders all human theology as inadequate as children's stories told to ease the fear of darkness. Tomorrow, he will return to his duties, will continue to serve as keeper of relics and guardian of mysteries, will maintain the careful records that document the impossible preservation of those who have died, but who refuse to embrace the full implications of death. But tonight, as he kneels in his cell and attempts to pray to a God whose nature seems increasingly uncertain, he cannot escape the image of Sister Agatha's closed eyes moving beneath their lids, tracking visions that span centuries, witnessing sights that bridge the gap between time and eternity. And in the silence of the monastery night, punctuated only by the distant sound of brothers chanting Compline in the chapel above, Brother Matthias wonders what dreams visit those who sleep, the sleep of the incorruptible. What prayers echo through minds that have been suspended between life and death for longer than any mortal soul was meant to endure. The morning mist clings to the hills surrounding the shrine of St. James as Rodrigo the merchant adjusts the lead badge pinned to his cloak, the sacred token that marks him as a pilgrim bound for Santiago de Compostela. The badge bears the image of a scallop shell, the symbol that has guided countless thousands along the ancient roads of northern Spain. But as Rodrigo's fingers trace its rough edges, he cannot shake the growing certainty that something about this particular emblem is deeply, terribly wrong. It is the autumn of 1456, and Rodrigo has walked for 3 months through the kingdoms of Castile and Leon, following the Camino de Santiago with the devotion of a man who seeks forgiveness for sins that weigh upon his soul, like stones in a pilgrim's pack. Behind him lie the bustling markets of Burgos, the soaring cathedral of Leon, and a dozen smaller shrines where he has knelt in prayer and left offerings of silver and gold. Before him stretches the final stage of his journey, the approach to the holy city, where the bones of St. James the Apostle rest in their silver reliquary, drawing pilgrims from every corner of Christendom with the promise of plenary indulgence and spiritual renewal. But the badge that should be his protection has become his curse, and with each passing day, Rodrigo feels the weight of supernatural malice gathering around him like storm clouds on the horizon of his soul. He purchased the badge from a vendor in Astorga, one of dozens of merchants who cluster around the cathedral, selling the sacred tokens that every pilgrim must possess to prove the authenticity of his journey. The man who sold it to him was unremarkable in every way, middle-aged, with the weathered hands of someone who works with metal, wearing the simple brown robe of a lay brother attached to one of the local monasteries. But his eyes, Rodrigo remembers, now with a shudder that has nothing to do with the morning cold, held something that should never be seen in a place dedicated to the service of God. They were the eyes of someone who takes pleasure in the suffering of others, who finds joy in the destruction of innocence, who serves powers that exist in eternal opposition to everything that the pilgrimage represents. The chronicles of medieval Spain are filled with warnings about counterfeit badges, sold by unscrupulous merchants who prey upon the devotion of the faithful. These false tokens, blessed by no legitimate authority and carrying no authentic connection to the sacred sites they claim to represent, are said to bring misfortune rather than protection, to attract the attention of malevolent forces rather than the favor of the saints. But Rodrigo suspects that his badge represents something far worse than mere fraud. The metal feels wrong beneath his fingers, too warm despite the chill morning air, pulsing with a rhythm that seems to echo the beating of his own heart. And since he pinned it to his cloak, his journey has been marked by a series of disasters that seem to precisely timed to be mere coincidence. First came the attack by bandits on the road outside Ponferrada, masked men who emerged from the forest, like creatures of nightmare, to rob him of most of his remaining gold. Rodrigo escaped with his life, but only after witnessing violence of such casual brutality that his dreams are still haunted by the screams of less fortunate pilgrims who happened to be traveling the same path. Then came the fever that struck him in the village of Fonsbadon, a malady that burned through his body for 3 days and nights while he lay delirious in a pilgrim hospice, speaking in tongues and seeing visions that belonged more to hell than heaven. The fever broke as suddenly as it had come, leaving him weak as a newborn but alive, though the sisters who tended him crossed themselves whenever they looked at him. There was the incident at the bridge of Urbago, where his horse suddenly reared and threw him into the muddy waters below for no apparent reason. The animal had been docile and reliable throughout the entire journey, but as they approached the ancient stone span, it began to tremble and foam at the mouth, as if confronted by something invisible to human eyes. Rodrigo nearly drowned in the swift current, saved only by the quick action of other pilgrims who happened to be crossing at the same time. Now, as he makes his way along the final stretches of the Camino, past villages whose churches have witnessed the passage of millions of pilgrims over the centuries. Rodrigo finds himself wondering whether his badge is truly a counterfeit or something far more sinister, a genuine artifact that has been deliberately corrupted, blessed by priests who serve not Christ but older, darker powers that predate the coming of Christianity to these ancient lands. He has heard whispers in the pilgrim hostels, stories told in hushed voices after the evening prayers have been completed and the candles have been extinguished, tales of badges that carry curses rather than blessings, tokens that mark their bearers not for salvation but for damnation, sacred symbols that have been twisted into instruments of spiritual destruction by those who understand how to pervert the very foundations of faith itself. The scallop shell that adorns Rodrigo's badge should represent the baptismal waters through which every soul must pass to achieve rebirth in Christ. But as he examines it more closely in the growing daylight, he begins to notice details that fill him with a dread deeper than any physical fear. The shell's ridges seem to form patterns that hurt the mind to follow, geometric designs that suggest meanings too terrible for conscious thought to encompass. And at the shell's center, where tradition places the symbol of the cross, there is instead a mark that resembles no Christian emblem he has ever seen. The mark seems to shift and change as he watches, sometimes appearing as a simple scratch in the metal, sometimes revealing itself as a complex sigil that speaks of traditions far older than the pilgrimage to Santiago. Rodrigo has read enough forbidden texts in his years as a merchant to recognize symbols associated with the mystery cults that flourished in Spain before the Roman legions brought their ordered pantheon to the Iberian Peninsula. And what he sees in the center of his pilgrim badge seems to echo those ancient signs of power and transgression. As the sun climbs higher and the mist begins to burn away from the surrounding hills, Rodrigo makes a decision that may save his soul or damn it irrevocably. He unpins the badge from his cloak and holds it in his palm, feeling the unnatural warmth that radiates from its surface, like the heat of fever or the touch of hell itself. For a moment, he considers simply discarding it, hurling it into the forest, undergrowth, and continuing his pilgrimage unmarked by any token save the sincerity of his repentance. But something about the badge's malevolent presence suggests that it will not be so easily abandoned, that the forces which have claimed it for their own will not release their hold on him, simply because he chooses to remove their physical symbol from his person. Instead, he wraps the badge in a piece of blessed cloth that he carries for the protection of his more valuable possessions. The metal grows cold in his hands as he performs this simple ritual of containment. And for the first time in days, Rodrigo feels the oppressive weight of supernatural attention begin to lift from his shoulders. But he knows that his ordeal is far from over, that the cursed badge represents only one aspect of a larger web of corruption that threatens to entangle his soul in consequences too terrible to imagine. Somewhere in the shadows of the pilgrimage route, those who serve the ancient powers continue to work their subtle influence, corrupting the symbols of faith and turning the very instruments of salvation into weapons of spiritual destruction. As Rodrigo continues his journey toward Santiago, the wrapped badge hidden deep in his pack, he carries with him the knowledge that evil can disguise itself in the most sacred forms, that corruption can wear the mask of holiness so perfectly that only the most carefully attuned spiritual senses can detect its presence. The pilgrimage that was meant to cleanse him of sin has instead revealed the depth of the darkness that exists even within the heart of Christendom itself, shadows that no amount of prayer or penance may ever fully dispel. The bells of Santiago ring across the hills ahead, calling the faithful to their final destination. But Rodrigo walks toward them with the heavy step of a man who has learned that some journeys lead not to redemption but to a deeper understanding of the price that must be paid for knowledge of good and evil. His badge lies silent in its wrappings, but he can feel its presence like a wound that refuses to heal. A reminder that the battle for the human soul is fought not only in the grand that determine whether we serve the light or surrender to the seductive whisper of ancient darkness. The ravens gather like black thoughts against the gray October sky, their harsh cries cutting through the morning air as King Harold's army takes its position along the ridge of Senlac Hill. Below them stretches the marshy ground where Norman cavalry will soon thunder across English soil, where the fate of kingdoms will be decided by the clash of sword and shield, by the flight of arrow and the courage of men who know they may not see another sunset. But Sir Godwin the Saxon, veteran of a dozen battles against Welsh raiders and Viking longships, finds his attention drawn not to the glittering ranks of William's invaders, but to the ominous congregation of black-winged harbingers that circle overhead like vultures awaiting a feast of carrion. In all his years of warfare, he has never seen so many ravens gathered in one place, their numbers darkening the sky until the sun itself seems obscured by wings that beat with the rhythm of prophecy itself. It is the morning of October 14th in the year 1066, and the Battle of Hastings is about to begin. But for Sir Godwin, who learned the old ways from his grandfather, who still remembers the songs that were sung before Christian bells replaced the horns that once called Saxon warriors to battle, the presence of the ravens carries meaning that transcends mere coincidence or natural behavior. The chronicles of medieval warfare are filled with accounts of supernatural omens that preceded great battles, signs and portents that seem to foretell the outcome of conflicts that would reshape the destiny of nations. From the fields of Poitiers to the walls of Constantinople, from the mountain passes of the Alps to the boglands of Ireland, warriors and chroniclers alike recorded the appearance of mysterious phenomena that suggested the intervention of powers beyond the reach of earthly strategy or human courage. But none of these omens carried the weight of ancient authority possessed by the ravens that wheel and cry above the English army on this fateful morning. For these are the birds of Odin, the messengers of the one-eyed god who ruled the northern pantheon before Christ brought his message of peace and salvation to the lands of the Anglo-Saxons. They are the choosers of the slain, the creatures who select which warriors will join the Einherjar in Valhalla's golden hall, which souls will feast forever at the table of the All-Father. Sir Godwin watches the ravens with the mixture of dread and fascination that his people have felt for these creatures since the first Saxon longships crossed the North Sea to claim these green hills for their own. The birds seem to move with purpose rather than mere instinct, arranging themselves in patterns that speak of intelligence far beyond the simple cunning of scavengers, awaiting the aftermath of human folly. He remembers the stories his grandfather told during the long winter nights, tales of how the ravens served as Odin's eyes and ears in the world of mortals, how they could see the threads of fate that connected every living soul to the moment of its destined death. Hugin and Munian, thought and memory, who flew each day across all the 9 worlds and returned each evening to whisper their secrets into the ear of the god, who traded his eye for wisdom, the Christian priests who have ministered to heralds' army speak of placing trust in God's will, of fighting with righteousness for the defense of their native soil against foreign invaders who come bearing the papal banner and claiming divine sanction for their conquest. But Sir Godwin, whose Saxon blood remembers older loyalties, older powers that ruled these lands when the Roman eagles first crossed the Channel, finds himself wondering whether the ravens have come not as mere scavengers but as witnesses to the end of an age. For this battle represents more than a struggle between Norman and Saxon, more than a contest between rival claimants to an earthly crown. It marks the collision of 2 worlds, 2 ways of understanding the relationship between gods and men, between fate and free will, between the ancient powers that shaped the destiny of the northern peoples and the new dispensation that promises salvation through submission to a God who died upon a cross. As Sir Godwin adjusts his grip on the great 2-handed axe that has served his family for 3 generations, he becomes aware that the ravens are watching him specifically, their dark eyes fixed upon his weathered face with an intensity that seems to strip away all pretense and see directly into the depths of his soul. In their unblinking gaze, he reads his fate as clearly as if it were written in runes upon a standing stone. He will die today, here on this blood-soaked hill, but his death will not be meaningless or random. It will be part of a larger pattern, a necessary sacrifice that will allow the old ways to pass into memory and the new age to be born from the ashes of Saxon resistance. The ravens know this, have known it since before the first Norman ship appeared on the horizon, have been gathering for days to witness the transformation that will reshape the spiritual landscape of England forever. The battle begins with the Norman archers loosing their arrows in clouds that darken the sky like a second flock of ravens, their iron points seeking Saxon flesh with the precision of divine judgment. Sir Godwin raises his shield against the deadly rain and feels the impact of shafts that seem guided by supernatural accuracy, each one a messenger of fate, delivered with the authority of powers that recognize no earthly allegiance. As the Norman cavalry charges up the slope, their war horses breathing steam like dragons in the cold morning air, the ravens overhead begin to cry with voices that drown out even the clash of weapons and the screams of the dying. Their harsh chorus seems to be counting the souls departing this world, marking each death with sounds that echo the ancient songs of the Valkyries who rode through storm clouds to gather the souls of heroes for their eternal reward. Sir Godwin swings his axe in great arcs that cleave through Norman shields and shatter Norman lances, fighting with the fury of a man who knows that his civilization dies with him, that each Saxon who falls brings closer the moment when the old gods will withdraw their protection from a land that has chosen new masters, new beliefs, new ways of understanding the sacred mysteries that govern the relationship between earth and sky. But even as he fights, even as his blade drinks deep from the well of Norman blood, he is aware of the ravens circling lower, their cries growing more urgent as they sense the approaching climax of the battle. One great raven, larger than the rest and bearing in its eyes a wisdom that seems almost human in its depth and sadness, alights on a broken spear thrust into the earth nearby and regards Sir Godwin with what can only be described as recognition. In that moment of eye-to-eye contact, Sir Godwin understands that he has been chosen not merely for death, but for a kind of immortality, that his story will become part of the greater tale that the ravens carry with them, as they fly between the world of the living and the realm of the gods. His last stand will be remembered in songs that have not yet been written. His courage will inspire warriors not yet born. His death will fertilize the soil from which new legends will grow. The raven spreads its wings and takes flight, just as a Norman sword finds the gap in Sir Godwin's mail, sliding between his ribs with the inevitability of fate itself. As he falls to his knees among the trampled grass and scattered weapons, as his life ebbs away with the setting sun, he sees the ravens departing in a great black cloud that wheels once around the battlefield, before disappearing into the gathering darkness. They carry with them the souls of the Saxon dead, but more than that, they bear away the essence of an age that is ending, the spirit of a people who fought and died for gods, whose names will soon be forgotten by all save the bards who keep the old stories alive in verses sung by firelight when winter winds howl around the halls of memory. Sir Godwin dies with a smile on his lips, knowing that the ravens remember everything, that somewhere in the vast halls of the Allfather, the heroic dead feast eternal, while black-winged messengers bring news of battles yet to be fought, of heroes yet to be born, of a world that continues to turn despite the fall of kings and the passing of ages. The Battle of Hastings ends with Norman victory, but the ravens who witnessed it carry away something more precious than any earthly crown: the knowledge that courage and honor transcend the boundaries of victory and defeat, that some truths are too deep to die with the civilizations that gave them birth, that in the end it is not the winner who matters, but the witness who remembers what was lost and what was preserved in the moment when one world ended and another began. The well stands in the center of Hamelin's market square like a stone eye staring up at heaven, its depths black as the inside of a tomb and twice as silent. Master Wilhelm the stonemason built it in the year of our Lord 1284, sinking the shaft 30 feet through clay and limestone until it tapped the underground river that has flowed beneath this Westphalian town since before the Romans built their first roads through the dark forests of Germania. But something went wrong with Wilhelm's work, something that he took to his grave without confession. And now the well that was meant to bring life to the growing town brings instead a horror that seeps upward from the earth's hidden places like the breath of hell itself. Brother Augustine draws his woolen robe closer as he approaches the cursed wellhead, carrying with him the tools of exorcism that the abbot of Fulda has blessed for this most perilous of tasks: holy water from the Jordan River, salt from the shores of the Dead Sea, a crucifix carved from wood taken from a tree that grew on the Mount of Olives, and prayers in Latin so ancient that their origins predate the establishment of the papal authority itself. It is the feast of Saint Michael the Archangel, the day when the barriers between heaven and earth grow thin enough for angels and demons alike to walk among mortals with greater freedom than the natural order typically permits. If ever there was a time to attempt the cleansing of this abomination, Brother Augustine knows it is now, when the power of the Church militant can call upon the assistance of the heavenly host in its eternal war against the forces of darkness. The chronicles of medieval Germany are filled with accounts of wells that became gateways to the underworld, sources of water that turned poisonous without warning or explanation, springs that bubbled up from depths where no Christian soul should venture to explore. From the Rhine Valley to the Baltic shores, from the Alps to the Danish marches, the Germanic peoples have always understood that water can carry more than life from the hidden places beneath the earth. But the well of Hamelin is different from these other cursed springs, more dangerous and more actively malevolent than any mere contamination of the water supply. For this well speaks, whispers, rising from its depths like the voices of the damned pleading for release from their eternal torments. Words that seem to bypass the ears entirely and plant themselves directly in the minds of those who dare to lean over its stone rim and peer into the darkness below. Brother Augustine has read the testimonies of the townspeople, statements given under oath before the magistrates and sealed with the authority of the Holy Roman Empire itself. They speak of voices that call to them in the dark hours before dawn, speaking their names with an intimacy that suggests knowledge of their most secret sins, their most carefully hidden shames. Heinrich the butcher swears that the well knows of the meat he sells despite knowing it comes from diseased animals, how he profits from the desperation of the poor who cannot afford better fare. The voices mock him with details of his deception, speaking of coins counted while children sicken, of wealth accumulated through the suffering of his neighbors. Greta, the baker's wife, claims the well whispers to her of the affairs she conducts while her husband works his ovens, how she meets with traveling merchants in the hayloft above their stable, trading her body for silks and spices that she cannot otherwise afford. The voices know the names of her lovers, the dates of their encounters, the lies she tells to cover her absences from home. Most disturbing of all is the testimony of Father Dietrich, the parish priest whose faith has been shaken to its foundations by what he has heard rising from the depths of the cursed well. He speaks of voices that recite his own private prayers back to him, but altered, corrupted, transformed into blasphemies that invert every sacred word he has ever spoken. They know of his secret doubts about transubstantiation, his questions about the nature of the Trinity, his moments of despair when he wonders whether God truly hears the prayers of mortal men. Brother Augustine has come to Hamelin at the request of the Bishop of Hildesheim, who received word of the phenomenon through channels that connect every monastery and cathedral in the Holy Roman Empire, in a vast network of communication that rivals the roads built by Caesar's legions. The Church has faced similar manifestations before, wells and springs that seem to tap into sources of knowledge that no earthly intelligence should possess, conduits through which the accumulated sins and secrets of entire communities rise like poisonous vapors from the depths of the earth. The theological explanation for such phenomena speaks of the earth itself as a repository of human wickedness, a vast receiver that absorbs the spiritual pollution generated by generations of sin and corruption. Just as the land can be contaminated by the blood of the innocent or cursed by the dying words of the unjustly executed, so too can the underground waters carry within their flow the essence of moral corruption that seeps down from the world above. But Brother Augustine suspects that the truth may be more complex and more terrifying than official. For the voices that rise from the well of Hamelin speak not only of present sins, but of transgressions that lie in the future. As the movements of the planets in their celestial courses, he sets down his leather satchel at the edge of the wellhead and begins the ritual of preparation that will allow him to confront whatever intelligence dwells in the darkness below. The holy water burns like liquid fire as he pours it in a circle around the stone rim, a line of white crystals that gleam like fallen stars in the morning sunlight. Brother Augustine has read the writings of the Church Fathers, who describe salt as the enemy of corruption, the substance that preserves flesh from decay and spirits from the influence of malevolent forces. But as he completes the circle, he notices that the salt begins to darken, each crystal turning gray, then black, as if some invisible fire were consuming it. From within, the crucifix he places upon the stone ledge of the well begins to vibrate. As soon as it comes to rest, trembling with a frequency that seems to resonate with sounds too low for human ears to detect, the wood, which should be as solid and stable as the faith it represents, appears to blur at the edges, as if the proximity to whatever dwells in the well below is causing its very substance to question the reality of its own existence. Brother Augustine begins the prayers of exorcism, words in Latin that have been used for centuries to drive demons back to the pit from which they emerged, to cleanse polluted places and restore them to their proper relationship with the divine order. But as he speaks, he becomes aware that other voices are speaking with him, echoing his words from the depths of the well, but altering them subtly, changing the meaning of each phrase in ways that transform prayers of banishment into invitations for darker powers to manifest themselves more fully in the world above. Exorcizo temen spiritus, he intones, calling upon the unclean spirit to depart. But from the well comes the response, invoco te, sanct spiritus, a corruption that transforms his command into a summons, his banishment into a welcome. The temperature around the well begins to drop, despite the warmth of the September morning, and Brother Augustine feels the presence of something vast and ancient stirring in the depths below. It is not merely a demon, he realizes with growing horror, but something older and more fundamental than the fallen angels who rebelled against heaven in the first days of creation. It is a fragment of the primordial chaos that existed before God spoke light into being, to reclaim the ordered world for the darkness from which it emerged. Voices that speak from the well multiply and harmonize, creating a chorus that seems to encompass every human voice that has ever been raised in anger, in despair, in hatred, or in the kind of sorrow that curdles into malice over the long years of disappointment and loss. They speak in languages that predate the construction of the Tower of Babel, tongues that were old when the first humans learned to shape sounds into words, syllables that carry within their structure the power to unmake the very foundations upon which reality itself is constructed. Brother Augustine falls to his knees as the full weight of the revelation crashes over him like a tide of liquid darkness. The well is not simply a conduit through which demons communicate with the world above. It is a wound in the fabric of existence itself, a place where the barriers between what is and what might have been have grown so thin that the alternative possibilities, the roads not taken, the choices not made, begin to bleed through into the realm of actuality. Every secret sin, every hidden shame, every moment of moral failure that the townspeople have committed or will commit exists simultaneously in the dark waters below, creating a repository of corruption so vast and so concentrated that it has achieved a kind of malevolent consciousness, an awareness that feeds on human weakness and grows stronger with every compromise of conscience, every betrayal of principle, every surrender to the temptations that lead souls away from the light of divine grace. The crucifix on the well's edge begins to smoke, its sacred wood burning without flame. Brother Augustine reaches for it instinctively, then cries out in pain as his fingers encounter heat more intense than any earthly fire, a burning that seems to penetrate not just his flesh but his very soul, threatening to corrupt his faith at its source. As the wooden cross crumbles to ash and the holy water boils away into steam, Brother Augustine understands that this battle cannot be won through the conventional tools of exorcism. The intelligence that dwells in the well of Hamelin has grown too powerful, no matter how ancient their authority or how pure the faith that wielded them. Instead, he realizes the only solution lies in a sacrifice so profound that it will seal the well forever, cutting off its connection to the sources of spiritual pollution that have allowed it to grow in power and malevolence. Someone must descend into the darkness below, must carry the light of faith into the very heart of the corruption and allow it to consume them completely, transforming their willing martyrdom into a barrier that no amount of accumulated sin can ever breach again. Brother Augustine rises to his feet with the slow, careful movements of a man who has just agreed to purchase eternal peace at the cost of temporal existence. He removes his woolen robe and lets it fall to the ground beside the ruined remains of his exorcism tools, standing in only the simple linen shift that marks him as a servant of the church that gave his life meaning and purpose. The voices from the well grow quiet as they sense his intention, their mocking chorus fading to whispers of surprise and something that might almost be respect, for they recognize in his decision the one form of human action that their corruption cannot touch, the willing sacrifice of self for the salvation of others. The choice to embrace destruction in order to prevent greater evil, the transformation of personal defeat into spiritual victory through the alchemy of perfect love. Brother Augustine steps over the rim of the well and begins his descent into the darkness below, carrying with him not the tools of exorcism but something far more powerful, the unshakable conviction that some battles can only be won through surrender, that some victories require the apparent defeat of those who achieve them, that the light shines brightest in the moment when it seems to be extinguished forever. The townspeople of Hamelin will wake tomorrow to find their well sealed with stones that no earthly force can move, waters that run clear and sweet and speak to no one of their secret shames. They will never know the name of the monk who descended into darkness to purchase their redemption. But in the decades that follow, when children play around the sealed wellhead and mothers draw water from new sources that never whisper of hidden sins. They will sometimes hear on the wind the sound of prayers being offered for their salvation by voices that speak from depths no living soul will ever fathom. The well of Hamelin stands silent now, its voice stilled forever by the willing sacrifice of one who understood that the greatest victory over evil comes not through force or ritual, but through the complete offering of self in service of a love that no darkness can comprehend or corrupt. And in that silence, Brother Augustine achieved the only form of immortality that truly matters, the knowledge that his death purchased life for others, that his descent into darkness brought light to a community that might otherwise have been consumed by the accumulated weight of its own sins. In the shadowed alcove of a Tudor manor house, where dust motes dance in shafts of afternoon sunlight like souls seeking entrance to paradise, hidden within the oak beams that support the great hall, concealed behind layers of plaster and lime mortar, lies a child's shoe so small it could fit in the palm of his weathered hand. The leather is worn smooth by years of use, shaped by the foot of a child who walked these floors when Henry VII still counted his claim to the throne in battles won rather than years reigned. But the shoe's placement speaks of purposes far removed from mere storage or careless misplacement. It has been deliberately sealed within the wall, surrounded by salt and iron nails, wrapped in cloth that bears symbols Master Geoffrey recognizes from whispered conversations in alehouse corners, signs that predate the cross and speak of protections older than Christianity itself. It is the autumn of 1534, and across England the monasteries tremble before the wrath of Henry VIII, whose break with Rome has set in motion changes that reach into every corner of English life, from the grandest cathedral to the humblest cottage. But here, in the manor of Sir Thomas Wainwright, the discoveries that Master Geoffrey makes speak of fears that transcend the political upheavals of kings and popes, anxieties that reach back to the very foundations of human civilization itself. For this is not the first shoe he has found. In the 6 months since Sir Thomas commissioned him to renovate the manor's aging structure, Master Geoffrey has uncovered more than a dozen such artifacts, each one carefully concealed within the walls or beneath the floorboards, each one surrounded by the paraphernalia of folk magic that transforms ordinary footwear into talismans of supernatural protection. The practice, he knows, is as old as the stones of Stonehenge, as ancient as the Roman walls that still mark the northern boundaries of civilization. Throughout England, from the Scottish borders to the chalk cliffs of Dover, families have followed the same ritual for generations uncounted, hiding worn shoes within the fabric of their homes to ward off witches, demons, and the countless unnamed terrors that emerge from darkness to prey upon the innocent and the vulnerable. Master Geoffrey examines the tiny shoe with the careful attention he usually reserves for rare woods or complicated joinery, noting the precise way it has been positioned with the toe pointing toward the rising sun, the heel aligned with magnetic north. The leather bears traces of oils that his nose tells him include lavender for purification, rowan berries for protection against enchantment, and something else that he cannot identify but which makes his skin crawl with primitive recognition of danger. The family histories that Sir Thomas has shared speak of the Wainwright lineage stretching back to the Norman conquest, of ancestors who served kings and bishops with equal loyalty, who built their fortune through careful allegiance to whatever power held sway in England's turbulent political landscape. But Master Geoffrey's discoveries suggest a parallel tradition, a shadow history of fears and precautions that the public records never mention, protective rituals that continued generation after generation, regardless of changes in dynasty or religious observance. He has found shoes of every size and description, tiny slippers that belonged to infants who never lived to see their first birthday, sturdy work boots that carried their owners through decades of labor in field and workshop, delicate dancing shoes that once graced the feet of ladies whose names are carved on marble tombs in the family chapel. Each one tells a story of someone who believed so strongly in the power of evil to reach into the sanctuary of home that they were willing to sacrifice their most intimate possessions to purchase supernatural protection. The theological implications of such practices trouble Master Geoffrey more than he cares to admit. A devout man who attends Mass regularly and supports the local parish with generous donations, he finds himself confronting evidence that even the most faithful Christian families have maintained beliefs and customs that the Church would condemn as superstition at best, witchcraft at worst. Yet the meticulous care with which these shoes have been concealed, the generations of repetition that the evidence suggests, speaks of a conviction so deep and enduring that it must be rooted in experiences too real to dismiss as mere folklore. Someone in each generation of the Wainwright family has believed strongly enough in the effectiveness of this protection to go to considerable trouble and expense to maintain it, hiding their activities from servants and neighbors, passing the knowledge from parent to child through whispered conversations that left no written record for historians to discover. As Master Geoffrey continues his examination of the tiny shoe, he becomes aware of something that makes his blood run cold in his veins. The leather shows signs of wear that extend far beyond what any living child could have inflicted. The sole is worn smooth, not by walking on floors and paths, but by something else entirely, by movement of a kind that human feet were never meant to perform. The wear patterns suggest not the normal motion of walking or running, but something more like shuffling, as if the shoe continued to be used long after its original owner had no further need for earthly footwear. And there are scratches on the leather that look disturbingly like claw marks, gouges that speak of struggles with forces that possessed neither human hands nor human intentions. Master Geoffrey has read the accounts that learned men write of such phenomena, explanations that speak of the shoe as a trap for malevolent spirits, a lure that attracts witches and demons and holds them prisoner within the leather confines until they waste away from frustration and impotence. The theory suggests that evil forces, drawn by the intimate connection between foot and shoe, by the residual essence of human presence that permeates the worn leather, find themselves unable to escape once they attempt to inhabit the artifact. But the evidence before his eyes suggests something far more disturbing than mere entrapment. The wear patterns, the claw marks, the way the leather seems to pulse with its own faint rhythm, all point toward the possibility that the shoes continue to be inhabited long after their concealment within the walls, that whatever forces they were meant to trap have instead found in them a new kind of existence, a way of remaining active and aware within the protected confines of the human household. The manor house around him suddenly seems less a shelter than a prison, filled with hidden occupants whose presence has been maintained for generations through rituals that the living inhabitants may no longer remember or understand. Each wall potentially conceals its own supernatural prisoner. Each floorboard may hide its own captive force, struggling eternally against bonds of leather and iron, salt and sacred symbol, yet somehow still capable of influencing the world beyond their confinement. Master Geoffrey sets the tiny shoe aside and turns his attention to the wall cavity from which he extracted it, examining the other objects that surround its hiding place. There are iron nails driven in patterns that hurt the mind to follow, their arrangement suggesting geometries that exist in dimensions beyond the three that human senses can perceive. Salt forms lines and circles that seem to shift and blur when looked at directly, as if the mundane substance has been transformed by proximity to forces that operate according to laws that predate the ordered universe itself. Most disturbing of all is a piece of parchment covered with writing in a hand so archaic that Master Geoffrey can make out only fragments of its meaning. The words that he can decipher speak of binding and holding, of forces contained and powers constrained, of bargains struck between the living and entities whose very existence challenges every assumption about the nature of reality that Christian doctrine teaches the faithful to accept. The document bears no signature, no date, no identifying marks that would connect it to any specific member of the Wainwright family. But the authority with which it speaks, the casual familiarity with supernatural forces that its language demonstrates, suggests that it was written by someone who considered trafficking with such powers to be as normal and necessary as maintaining the manor's roof or ensuring adequate stores of grain for the winter months. As the afternoon light fades and shadows begin to gather in the corners of the great hall, Master Geoffrey finds himself faced with a decision that will determine not only his own fate, but the spiritual well-being of everyone who dwells within these walls. He can replace the shoes and their protective paraphernalia, sealing them back within the walls and trusting that whatever bargains his predecessors made with the forces of darkness will continue to hold, or he can remove them entirely, dismantling protections that have been maintained for centuries and trusting that the power of Christian faith will prove sufficient to ward off whatever consequences may follow. The choice weighs upon him like a physical burden, for he understands that either path carries risks too terrible to contemplate fully. To leave the shoes in place means accepting that his Christian home harbors forces of darkness, that the sanctuary he has worked to create for Sir Thomas and his family rests upon foundations of compromise with evil itself. But to remove them means gambling with the safety of everyone under this roof, betting their lives and souls on theological certainties that may prove inadequate when confronted with powers that predate the very concept of salvation through divine grace. Master Geoffrey wraps the tiny shoe in a piece of clean linen and places it carefully in his tool chest, knowing that the decision he makes will echo through generations yet unborn, that the consequences of his choice will influence the fate of children not yet conceived, of souls that will one day call this manor home without ever knowing of the supernatural inhabitants that may share their dwelling. Tomorrow he will speak with Sir Thomas, will attempt to explain discoveries that challenge every assumption about the nature of the English home, about the relationship between the world of Christian faith and the older powers that lurk in the shadows of human civilization. But tonight, as he walks home through lanes where autumn mist clings to hedgerows like the breath of sleeping ghosts, Master Geoffrey carries with him the weight of knowledge that no amount of prayer or penance can entirely ease, the understanding that protection sometimes requires accommodation with forces too dark to name, that safety may demand compromises that no truly faithful soul should be asked to make. The shoes hidden in England's walls continue their eternal watch. Guardians and prisoners both, protecting the homes that shelter them while harboring within their leather confines the very forces they were meant to repel. And in the space between protection and contamination, between safety and corruption, between the light of faith and the darkness of necessity, generations of English families have made their peace with mysteries that no theology can fully explain or entirely condemn. In the torchlit chamber beneath Buda Castle, where the stone walls weep with moisture drawn from the Danube's depths and shadows dance like living things in the flickering light, King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary kneels before an altar that should not exist in any Christian realm. Upon the ancient stone rests a crown of gold and gems, beautiful beyond description and terrible beyond comprehension, its jeweled surface pulsing with an inner fire that speaks of powers older than the kingdom it was meant to rule, the crown of Saint Stephen, sacred relic of Hungarian sovereignty, blessed by popes and worn by kings for 500 years, has begun to burn with a heat that no earthly fire could generate. And in that supernatural conflagration, King Matthias sees reflected the judgment of heaven itself, the divine displeasure that falls upon rulers who have forgotten that earthly authority is merely a stewardship granted by powers far greater than any mortal sovereign. It is the winter of 1489. And throughout the kingdom of Hungary, whispers speak of the crown's curse, of the way it has rejected every monarch who has dared to place it upon his head since the death of the saintly king, whose name it bears. The chronicles record the fates of those who wore it unworthily, madness that struck within hours of the coronation ceremony, mysterious illnesses that wasted the body while leaving the mind intact to suffer every moment of decline, sudden deaths that came without warning in the midst of apparent health and strength. King Matthias approaches the cursed crown with the slow, careful movements of a man who knows he walks upon ground that may open beneath his feet to reveal the pit of hell itself. He has read the accounts written by court chroniclers, has studied the testimonies of bishops and archbishops who witnessed the crown's supernatural manifestations, has consulted with scholars who claim to understand the theological implications of regalia that appears to possess its own consciousness, its own will, its own power to judge the worthiness of those who would claim dominion over Christian peoples. The crown's history reads like a catalogue of divine intervention in the affairs of mortals, a record of how heaven responds when earthly rulers forget the source of their authority and the responsibilities that accompany power. Cast from gold, taken from Byzantine treasuries, and adorned with gems that once graced the regalia of Roman emperors, It was blessed by Pope Sylvester II in the year 1000 as a symbol of Hungary's conversion to Christianity and its acceptance into the community of Christian nations. But from its earliest days, the crown demonstrated qualities that transcended mere symbolism or ceremonial function. Witnesses reported that it grew warm when worn by kings who ruled with justice and mercy, that its gems sparkled with unusual brilliance during periods of peace and prosperity. Conversely, it became cold and heavy upon the heads of tyrants, its weight increasing until some monarchs could barely support it, its jeweled surface growing dim as if the divine light that animated it had been withdrawn in displeasure. King Matthias remembers the stories told by his grandfather about the reign of King Andrew III, whose coronation with St. Stephen's crown was followed immediately by disasters that seemed to spring from the very fabric of divine judgment. The crown burned upon his head during the ceremony, raising blisters on his scalp that never healed, marking him with wounds that reminded all who looked upon him of his unworthiness to wear the sacred circlet. Within a year, Andrew's kingdom was torn apart by rebellions that seemed to ignite simultaneously across the land, as if some supernatural signal had been given to every ambitious nobleman who harbored dreams of seizing the throne for himself. Plague followed war, famine followed plague, and foreign enemies pressed in from every border. Sensing that the kingdom had lost the divine protection that had shielded it for centuries, Andrew died in agony, his body covered with the same burning lesions that had first appeared beneath the crown's golden band. His last words, a confession of sins so terrible that the priests who heard them imposed penances that would have taken lifetimes to complete. The crown was removed from his head by bishops who wore thick gloves to protect their hands from its supernatural heat, and for decades afterward it rested in the Cathedral of Esztergom, too dangerous for any mortal ruler to dare approach. Now, King Matthias faces the same trial that has destroyed or elevated every Hungarian monarch for nearly 5 centuries. The test that separates true kings from mere pretenders to royal authority. The crown waits upon its altar like a sleeping dragon, beautiful and deadly, offering dominion over one of Europe's great kingdoms to anyone bold enough to claim it, yet promising destruction to any who prove unworthy of the responsibilities that accompany such power. The king extends his hands toward the crown and feels the heat, radiating from its surface like warmth from a forge fire. But this is not the clean heat of honest labor or purifying flame. It is something else entirely, a burning that seems to penetrate not just flesh but soul, examining every hidden corner of his heart and mind, weighing every decision he has made since accepting the burden of royal authority, measuring his worthiness according to standards that no human wisdom can fully comprehend. Matthias has prepared for this moment through months of fasting and prayer, through consultations with the holiest men in his kingdom, through pilgrimages to shrines where the bones of saints rest in golden reliquaries and miracles occur with sufficient frequency to suggest genuine divine presence. He has confessed his sins to archbishops who possess the authority to grant absolution for transgressions that would damn ordinary souls, has performed penances that left his knees bloody from kneeling on stone floors and his back scarred from the disciplines of the flagellant orders. He feels the full weight of supernatural judgment pressing down upon him like the stone of mountains. Every harsh sentence he has pronounced as judge, every execution he has ordered as king, every moment when he has chosen political expediency over moral principle, rises before his inner vision with the clarity of illuminated manuscripts. The crown knows all of it, remembers every act and every intention, weighs them against the perfect standard of the Saint King whose authority it represents. The heat intensifies as Matthias lifts the crown from its altar, and for a moment he fears that it will burn through his flesh entirely, that he will join the ranks of those monarchs whose unworthiness was demonstrated through agonies too terrible for chroniclers to record in complete detail. But as he raises the sacred circlet toward his head, something shifts in the quality of the burning, transforming it from punishment to purification, from judgment to acceptance. The crown settles upon his head with a weight that speaks not of burden but of responsibility, willingly accepted, of authority granted by powers that transcend earthly politics and human ambition. The gems blaze with light that illuminates not just the chamber around him but the hidden reaches of his own soul, revealing depths of purpose and potential that he had never suspected existed within himself. In that moment of divine acceptance, King Matthias understands that the crown's curse is actually its greatest blessing, that its power to destroy unworthy rulers is precisely what makes it capable of transforming those who prove themselves ready for the responsibility of Christian kingship. The heat that burns away the dross of selfishness and ambition also forges the refined gold of genuine sovereignty, creating monarchs who rule not for their own glory but as instruments of divine will in the world of mortals. The supernatural fire that flows through the crown's gold and gems becomes a current of power that connects him to the long line of Hungarian kings who wore it worthily, to the saint whose name it bears, and ultimately to the source of all earthly authority that flows from heaven to earth through the sacrament of royal anointing. He feels their presence around him, a council of crowned spirits who watch over the kingdom they once served and who stand ready to guide and protect those who prove themselves worthy successors to their throne. But the crown's acceptance comes with obligations that no merely human ruler could fulfill through natural abilities alone. It demands not just justice, but perfect justice, not just mercy, but divine mercy, not just wisdom, but the kind of understanding that can penetrate the mysteries of human nature and discern the difference between true righteousness and the appearance of virtue that often conceals corruption beneath its attractive surface. King Matthias rises from his knees with the sacred crown blazing upon his head like a star descended from heaven, knowing that he has been transformed by the encounter from a mortal ruler into something approaching the ideal of Christian kingship that theologians describe but which history so rarely witnesses. The power that flows through him is not his own but belongs to the office he holds, and it will remain with him only so long as he remembers that earthly sovereignty is a sacred trust rather than a personal possession. In the years that follow, Hungary will flourish under his rule as it has not flourished for generations, its borders secure, its people prosperous, its culture blooming like a garden watered by divine favor. The crown that once burned with the fire of judgment now shines with the light of blessing, its gems reflecting the glory that attends rulers who understand that true majesty lies not in the exercise of power, but in its restraint, not in the accumulation of wealth, but in its distribution, not in the fear of subjects, but in their love freely given to sovereigns, who prove themselves worthy of the sacred trust that places the fate of kingdoms in mortal hands. The crown of Saint Stephen rests easy upon the head of King Matthias Corvinus, its supernatural heat transformed into the warmth of divine approval, its weight becoming light as the burden is shared between mortal will and heavenly grace. And in the harmony between earthly ruler and sacred office, between human ambition and divine purpose, the ancient promise is fulfilled that makes earthly kingdoms reflections of heavenly glory, temporal authority an echo of eternal power, and mortal rulers instruments through which the will of heaven works its purposes in the world of men. The wind howls across the Orkney Islands with a voice that carries within it the memories of 1,000 storms, of longships driven onto rocks by gales that seem to possess malevolent intelligence, of fishing boats that set out in calm seas only to vanish without trace when the weather turns with supernatural suddenness. But tonight, as Morag the wise woman stands upon the cliffs of mainland, her gray hair whipping in the salt-laden air, she knows that the wind which approaches carries more than mere meteorological fury. It is the autumn of 1462, and in the cottage, below the cliff path, Magnus the fisherman lies dying of wounds that no earthly blade inflicted, his body bearing marks that speak of an encounter with forces that exist beyond the reach of human understanding. 3 days ago, he purchased wind from Morag herself, paid silver for the promise of favorable breezes that would fill his nets with herring, and carry his boat safely back to harbor before the season's storms began their assault upon the northern seas. But something went wrong with the transaction, something that Morag's grandmother would have recognized and warned against, some violation of the ancient protocols that govern the relationship between human need and the elemental powers that control the movement of air and water across the world's surface. The wind that Morag sold in 3 knots, tied into a length of rope, blessed with herbs and blood, has returned to claim a price far greater than the silver coins that now burn like brands of guilt in the leather purse hidden beneath her hearth stones. The chronicles of medieval Scotland speak of such women throughout the Highlands and Islands, practitioners of arts that predate the arrival of Christianity by centuries, wielders of knowledge that allows them to negotiate with forces that most souls dare not acknowledge exist. They are the storm sellers, the wind witches, the guardians of secrets that transform the very air into commodity that can be bought and sold like grain or cattle, or any other product that sustains human life in the harsh northern latitudes. More learned the wind trade from her grandmother, who learned it from her grandmother before her, in an unbroken chain of transmission that reaches back to the days when the Roman legions abandoned their northernmost fortresses and left the Pictish peoples to face the elements with nothing but their own accumulated wisdom and their understanding of how to make bargains with powers that inhabit the spaces between earth and sky. The process seems simple enough to those who have never attempted it. Ropes knotted according to patterns that encode the strength and direction of desired winds, each knot infused with the essence of specific atmospheric conditions through rituals that must be performed at precise moments, determined by the positions of moon and stars. The purchaser takes the rope to sea and unties the knots in sequence, releasing purchased breezes in measured quantities that should provide exactly the wind conditions that their silver has bought. But Morag knows, as her grandmother knew, and her great-grandmother before her, that wind is not merely moving air, but a manifestation of intelligences that exist in the vast spaces above the earth. Entities whose consciousness spans continents and whose memories encompass the rise and fall of ice ages. To bind such forces into lengths of rope, to reduce their cosmic purposes to the service of human fishing boats and merchant vessels, requires more than ritual knowledge and careful timing. It demands a relationship built upon mutual respect and carefully negotiated exchange. An understanding that the powers which control the movement of air across the world's surface are not servants to be commanded, but partners in transactions that must benefit both parties if they are to avoid consequences that no amount of human cleverness can anticipate or control. Magnus paid his silver and received his knotted rope according to customs that had served fishermen throughout the northern islands for generations beyond count. But in his desperation to compete with younger men who possessed stronger nets and more seaworthy boats, he violated the fundamental rule that governs all commerce with elemental forces. He untied all 3 knots at once, releasing in a single moment winds that were meant to be parceled out over the course of several days. The result was a storm of such concentrated fury that it seemed to possess personal malice. Winds that howled with voices that spoke in languages older than human speech, gusts that struck his boat with the precision of deliberate attacks rather than the random violence of natural weather. Magnus's boat was driven before the gale for hours, its timbers groaning with stresses that should have shattered any vessel built by human hands. Its sails stretched taut by forces that seemed to pour down from the sky itself like waterfalls of invisible violence. When the storm finally exhausted its fury, Magnus found himself on a beach he did not recognize, his boat somehow intact, but bearing marks of claws and teeth that no earthly creature could have inflicted. His own body carried similar wounds, parallel scratches that ran from shoulder to hip, as if something with talons the size of sword blades had raked him while he struggled to control his vessel in the supernatural tempest. But worse than the physical injuries were the memories that the experience had burned into his mind, visions of what he had encountered in the heart of the windstorm, the intelligences that inhabit the flowing air and who had been roused to fury by his misuse of the rope that bound fragments of their essence to his mortal purposes. He spoke of riders in the sky, mounted figures whose horses were made of cloud and lightning, whose spears were forged from ice, and whose armor gleamed with the cold fire of the aurora borealis. They had surrounded his boat in the storm's eye. These supernatural cavalry of the upper air and their leader had spoken to him in words that bypassed his ears entirely, planting themselves directly in his consciousness with authority that no earthly voice could challenge. The message was simple and terrible. He had violated ancient agreements, had used power without understanding its source or respecting its nature. And for this transgression he would pay a price that would serve as warning to others who might be tempted to abuse the gifts that elemental forces occasionally bestow upon mortal supplicants. Now Morag stands upon the clifftop, watching the approach of clouds that move with purpose rather than merely following the dictates of atmospheric pressure and temperature differential. Within their roiling darkness, she can see shapes that suggest the presence of the Wind Riders, the aerial host that has come to collect the debt that Magnus incurred through